In the realm of high finance, we often discuss the time value of money, but rarely do we confront the more haunting reality, the asymmetry of time. If you are currently navigating your 20s, you are standing within a narrow, invisible window of compounding potential that will slam shut the moment you blow out the candles on your 30th birthday. This is not hyperbole. It is a mathematical certainty dictated by the power law of compounding. Most individuals perceive their 20s as a decade for experimentation or finding themselves, assuming that the real work of wealth building begins in their 30s when salaries typically peak. This is a catastrophic misunderstanding of financial physics. In the world of long-term investing, time is the exponent, and the exponent is the heavy lifter. Consider the 7 times multiplier. A single dollar deployed into a productive asset at age 25 possesses approximately 7 times the terminal value at retirement compared to that same dollar deployed at 35. By delaying your entry into the market by a mere decade, you haven't just lost 10 years. You have effectively handicapped your future self's wealth-generating engine by an order of magnitude. You cannot out-earn, outwork, or out-invest the loss of a decade. This is the invisible window. It is a period of low structural liability and high risk tolerance. In your 20s, you likely lack the heavy anchors of a mortgage, childcare, or senior medical expenses. This creates a unique liquidity surplus that disappears as life complexity increases. Two individuals can earn identical 6-figure salaries at age 40, yet inhabit entirely different economic universes based solely on their behavior during this decade. One is a sovereign individual with options. The other is a high-earning slave to their debt obligations. The window is closing. Every day you spend in a state of financial drift is a day of exponential growth you have permanently surrendered. You only get one shot at your 20s. Don't spend it financing a lifestyle you haven't earned at the expense of a freedom you'll never achieve. In behavioral economics, we study a phenomenon known as hedonic adaptation, often referred to as the hedonic treadmill. It is the observed tendency of humans to quickly return to a relatively stable level of happiness despite major positive events such as a significant pay raise. For most young professionals, this is the silent killer of wealth. The moment that first real paycheck hits the bank account, a psychological shift occurs. You feel you have finally arrived, and your brain immediately begins to rationalize a higher baseline of consumption to match your new status. This is the fork in the road where James and Chris diverged. James fell victim to status signaling. He viewed his $45,000 salary as a license to upgrade his life. A solo apartment, a reliable but expensive new car, and the convenience of dining out. To James, this felt like the natural progression of adulthood. In reality, he was voluntarily shackling himself to a high burn rate. He eliminated the gap, that critical margin between what you earn and what you spend. Without a gap, there is no surplus. Without surplus, there is no capital to deploy. And without capital, you are simply a high-functioning consumer, not an investor. Chris, conversely, utilized a mental model known as strategic delay. He understood that the highest returning investment he could make in his 20s was the maintenance of his broke college student lifestyle. By choosing roommates over solitude and a paid-off beater over a finance status symbol, Chris protected his capital. He recognized that wealth is not what you see: the cars, the watches, the prime real estate, but what you don't see: the assets on the balance sheet that are quietly compounding while you sleep. From a logic-based perspective, James was paying an immense opportunity cost. Every $500 he spent on a car payment or a premium apartment was $500 that could no longer work for him. In your 20s, the opportunity cost of consumption is at its absolute peak. If we apply the 7 times multiplier discussed earlier, James wasn't just spending $500 a month on a car. He was effectively spending $3,500 of his future retirement fund every single month. Over 7 years, that decision alone created a $60,000 chasm in net worth. The math of lifestyle inflation is a zero-sum game. You cannot have both the appearance of wealth today and the reality of wealth tomorrow if you are starting from zero. Chris's friends may have viewed him as cheap, but he was actually practicing capital allocation mastery. He was buying his future freedom at a discount. By age 30, Chris has a $60,000 engine generating passive returns, while James has a collection of memories of expensive dinners and a car that has lost half its value. The treadmill is moving, but only one of them has figured out how to step off. In the architecture of wealth, debt is not merely a financial obligation, it is compounding in reverse. If the power of interest is the 8th wonder of the world when it works for you, it becomes a catastrophic black hole when it works against you. Most young professionals view their student loans through the lens of linear thinking. They see a monthly payment, they see a balance, and they assume that as long as they meet the minimum requirement, they are financially responsible. This is a fundamental error in risk assessment. Consider the divergence in the debt dynamics of James and Chris. Both began their careers with a $35,000 student loan anchor. James followed the path of least resistance, adhering to a standard 10-year repayment plan. He viewed his $350 monthly payment as a fixed utility cost, much like his Netflix subscription or electric bill. Because he could afford the monthly outflow, he felt no urgency to eliminate the source. What James failed to realize was that he was paying a resilience tax. By carrying that debt for the full decade, he wasn't just paying interest. He was forfeiting the margin of safety that debt-free living provides. Every dollar sent to a loan servicer is a dollar that cannot be used to buy a dip in the stock market or fund a high-risk, high-reward career move. Chris, applying the mental model of inversion, viewed his debt not as a monthly bill, but as a systemic emergency. He understood that a 6% or 7% interest rate on a loan is a guaranteed negative return. Before seeking a 10% return in the equity markets, he sought the guaranteed 7% return of debt elimination. By aggressively attacking his principal, living in that cramped apartment, and diverting every windfall to his loans, Chris achieved debt zero by age 27. The logical consequence of this decision is staggering, and it extends far beyond the interest saved. The moment Chris paid off his loans, he effectively gave himself a $350 a month raise without needing a promotion. From age 27 to 30, he redirected that entire $350, plus the additional $1,000 a month he had been using to attack the debt, into a brokerage account. While James was still treading water, making his 84th consecutive minimum payment, Chris was already 3 years into an aggressive investment cycle. In the world of capital allocation, Chris had successfully transitioned from being a debtor to a capitalist. By age 30, the gap created by this single decision is approximately $40,000 in net worth. But the hidden delta is even more profound. Chris now has the velocity of capital on his side. James is still losing energy to interest. Chris is gaining energy from dividends. Debt is the gravity of the financial world. It pulls you down and keeps you slow. Chris broke free of that gravity while his window of opportunity was still wide open, and the trajectory he has set is now exponentially higher than James could ever hope to reach by following the reasonable path. In the world of professional finance, we often look for arbitrage, an opportunity to capture a guaranteed profit with zero risk. For the average employee, the most accessible form of arbitrage is the employer-sponsored retirement match. It is, quite literally, a 100% immediate return on investment, yet this is where most young professionals commit their most egregious error. They succumb to analysis paralysis and the omission bias. When James was presented with his 401k options, his brain's risk avoidance mechanism fired incorrectly. Overwhelmed by a menu of 20 different mutual funds, expense ratios, and technical jargon, he chose the path of later. This is a classic behavioral trap. James didn't consciously decide not to save for retirement. He simply failed to act because the perceived cognitive load was too high. In the logic of wealth, however, omission is a decision. By failing to enroll, James wasn't being cautious was actively forfeiting a 3% salary increase, and more importantly, he was wasting the most precious fuel in the universe, time in the market. Chris, applying a mental model of satisficing over maximizing, understood that a good enough plan implemented today is infinitely superior to a perfect plan implemented 5 years from now. He didn't need to be a hedge fund manager to understand the math. He realized that the employer match was free money. By immediately contributing 6% to capture the full 3% match, Chris effectively engineered a 50% instant gain before the market even moved a single point. He chose a target date fund, a self-rebalancing vehicle designed for the too hard box, and automated the process. Let us analyze the opportunity cost of delay. From age 23 to 30, Chris funneled $27,000 of his own capital and $13,000 of arbitraged employer money into his account. With moderate market growth, he arrived at age 30 with $55,000. James, having waited until 28 to begin, has a balance near zero, but the $55,000 gap is merely the tip of the iceberg. Because Chris leveraged the exponential nature of time, that $55,000 is a seed asset. Even if Chris never contributes another penny, at an average 7% return, that sum could compound to over $500,000 by his retirement. James, to reach that same $500,000 finish line, will have to contribute significantly more of his after-tax income later in life when his window of time has shrunk. James is attempting to compensate for lost time with increased volume, a strategy that is mathematically difficult and psychologically draining. In your 20s, the greatest leverage you possess is not your salary. It is the systemic participation in tax-advantaged accounts. Chris didn't need to pick the winning stock. He simply needed to let the system work for him, while his exponent was still large. James, By waiting to understand it better, ensured that he would have to work twice as hard for half the result. In the game of wealth, the cost of being late is often higher than the cost of being wrong. In behavioral finance, there is a cognitive bias known as mental accounting. It describes the human tendency to categorize money differently based on its source, treating a $1,000 tax refund as found money to be splurged, while treating $1,000 of earned salary as serious money for bills. To the rational analyst, a dollar is fungible. Its value remains constant regardless of how it arrived. To the average 2-0, something, however, a windfall is an excuse for a hedonic spike. James fell perfectly into this trap. Every time he received a tax refund, a performance bonus, or a monetary gift, his brain immediately moved those funds into a separate, fun money account. He viewed these windfalls as a cosmic reward for his hard work, a chance to upgrade his television, buy new clothes, or fund a weekend getaway he hadn't planned for. Over the span of a decade, James likely received upwards of $35,000 in these small, intermittent bursts. Because he spent them 100% on consumption, that capital was effectively deleted from his life's balance sheet. He was choosing transient pleasure over structural wealth. Chris, however, utilized a mental model of systemic routing. He understood that windfalls are the turbochargers of wealth building. Instead of letting his emotions dictate the spend, he pre-committed to a 75/25 rule. Whenever unexpected capital arrived, 75% was automatically diverted to his high-velocity goals, either debt payoff or his brokerage account, while the remaining 25% was allocated for enjoyment. This strategy is a masterpiece of behavioral engineering. By allowing himself that 25%, Chris avoided frugality fatigue and stayed motivated. But by capturing the 75%, he was able to inject $30,000 of additional principal into his investments over 10 years. In the world of compounding, this excess capital doesn't just sit there. It acts as a force multiplier. By age 30, this $30,000 difference isn't just a static gap in their bank accounts. For Chris, that money is now a self-sustaining engine, generating dividends and capital gains that James will never see. While James has a collection of outdated gadgets and fading travel memories, Chris has used his windfalls to buy back years of his future working life. James treated his windfalls as a reason to celebrate. Chris treated them as a reason to accelerate. In your 20s, the way you handle the extra determines how much you'll eventually have of the essential. In the hierarchy of wealth-destroying assets, the automobile reigns supreme. For the majority of young professionals, the car is not merely transportation. It is a status signal financed by the future. In my analysis of long-term wealth, I call this the depreciation death spiral. Most people in their 20s view a car payment as a standard, inevitable life utility, much like rent or electricity. But from a capital allocation perspective, financing a new vehicle is a catastrophic misstep that combines high interest with a rapidly melting principal. Consider the divergence in the transportation logic of James and Chris. James followed the path of social mimicry. He felt that his professional title required a vehicle that projected success. At age 23, he financed a $28,000 sedan. By 26, he succumbed to hedonic adaptation and upgraded to a $35,000 model, and by 29, he traded again for a $40,000 SUV. James wasn't just paying for the car, he was paying for the opportunity cost of depreciating capital. He spent $60,000 over 7 years in payments, insurance, and interest to eventually own an asset worth only $20,000. He effectively lit $40,000 on fire to look the part. Chris, however, applied the mental model of utility optimization. He understood that a car is a tool with a single function, moving a person from point A to point B reliably. He purchased a used Honda for $8,000 in cash. While James was sending $500 a month to a lender, Chris was sending that same $500 to his brokerage account. He ignored the embarrassment of driving an older model because he was focused on the asymmetry of value. Chris spent a total of $11,000 including maintenance, and at age 30, still owns an asset worth $4,000. The math here is brutal. The net worth difference between James and Chris on the car decision alone is approximately $36,000, but the realized opportunity cost is closer to $100,000. Why? Because while James's $500 monthly payments were evaporating into the balance sheet of a bank, Chris's $500 monthly investments were compounding at a 7 to 10% annual rate in the equity markets. By age 30, Chris has an extra $100,000 in his portfolio simply because he refused to finance a status symbol. He drove the boring car so he could eventually afford the sovereign life. James spent his 20s making the car company rich. Chris spent his 20s making himself rich. In the game of wealth building, you must choose between looking wealthy and being wealthy. If you choose the former in your 20s, the depreciation death spiral will ensure you never achieve the latter. We arrive now at the final summation of the James versus Chris case study. At age 30, the numerical gap is undeniable, a $285,000 chasm in net worth. But as a senior analyst, I must tell you that the money is merely a proxy for something far more valuable: sovereignty. Wealth is not about the ability to buy things. It is about the ability to command your own time and dictate the terms of your existence. At 30, Chris has achieved optionality. Because he possesses a $180,000 engine compounding in the background, he can afford to take risks that James cannot even contemplate. Chris can pivot to a lower paying but more fulfilling career path. He can take a 6-month sabbatical to travel or reskill. He can negotiate from a position of absolute strength because he does not need his next paycheck to survive. Chris has successfully used his 20s to buy FU money, the ultimate barrier between a human being and a life of quiet desperation. James, conversely, has entered a state of structural fragility. Despite his $65,000 salary, he is functionally trapped. Every decision he makes is dictated by his debt obligations and his high-burn lifestyle. He cannot afford to quit a toxic job, he cannot afford to start a business, and he cannot afford to wait for a better opportunity. James is a high-earning slave to his past decisions. He is running a race where he is starting 50 yards behind, and because Chris's wealth is now compounding, the gap between them will continue to widen exponentially, even if they earn the exact same salary for the rest of their lives. This is the window of opportunity I spoke of. Once you turn 30, the cost of entry into the millionaire class rises tenfold. You can no longer rely on the sheer, brute force of time to do the heavy lifting. You have to compensate with much higher contribution rates, which is difficult to achieve when life standard expenses, family, mortgage, healthcare, begin to peak. If you are still in your 20s, look at your balance sheet today. Are you James or are you Chris? If you see James in the mirror, understand that you are not doomed, but you are out of time. You must stop the bleeding immediately. Every month you delay is a month of future freedom you are voluntarily setting on fire. Start living below your means today. Attack your debt like it's a fire in your house. Automate your investments. Buy back your future. The window is closing. Don't let the 30th birthday be the day you realize you've locked yourself out of a sovereign life forever. The divergence between James and Chris is not a cautionary tale about budgeting. It is a clinical demonstration of the power law of early intervention. In the current economic landscape, we are witnessing the death of the middle-class safety net, meaning that an individual's 20s have shifted from a decade of leisure to a high-stakes capital allocation period. The most alarming signal is the hidden velocity gap. The reality that once a peer has achieved a 6-figure compounding base by 30, they have effectively exited the labor competition that everyone else is still fighting. This content serves as a reminder that in 2026, time is no longer a luxury. It is a volatile asset that must be captured before your structural liabilities explode. The strategic imperative is clear. You must choose between the temporary prestige of a financed lifestyle and the permanent sovereignty of early-stage capital accumulation. Those who fail to make this distinction will spend their 40s trying to buy back the freedom they traded for a used SUV in their 20s.